Arthur and Julia Whitlock, once surrounded by 5 successful children they raised through decades of sacrifice, now find themselves abandoned with nothing but a dying truck and their aging German Shepherd, Ranger. The rain had been relentless that day, soaking through Arthur's jacket as he watched bailiffs load furniture onto trucks. Each piece represented a memory. Julia sat in the pickup, oxygen tube trailing from her nose, one hand resting protectively on Ranger's head. The dog hadn't left her side since the foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks earlier. Their eldest son, Bradford, approached, designer umbrella shielding his tailored suit. His wife, Gracie, waited in their Range Rover, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Dad, you can't keep living beyond your means." Bradford extended a manila envelope. "The nursing home in Pinecrest has an opening. They've agreed to take you both next week." Arthur stared at his son. "Nursing home? We're not invalids, Bradford. Your mother needs her medication and proper care." "Yes, but we can manage. The fees are reasonable, and they have excellent medical facilities for Mom. They don't allow pets." He glanced at Ranger. Arthur's voice cracked. "Ranger's been with us through everything. We mortgaged this house to save your restaurant, paid for Diana's law school, and covered Kevin's gambling debts. 47 years here, and you want us to abandon our family?" "He's a dog, Dad, not family." Bradford sighed. Gracie finally emerged from the Range Rover, designer heels clicking on wet pavement. "Arthur, be practical. You're both sick, broke, and frankly, a burden we can't afford anymore. That dog is just another mouth to feed." Julia struggled out of the truck, oxygen tank trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. "We gave you our life savings, our retirement, our home equity. We chose you over our own security, and you won't even let us keep our dog?" Diana approached legal documents in a waterproof portfolio. At 45, their lawyer daughter had perfected the art of emotionless efficiency. "We've arranged for Ranger to go to a shelter. It's the most humane option given your circumstances." "Humane?" Arthur felt something snap inside him, not his heart breaking, but his patience. "I worked 60-hour weeks at the factory for 30 years so you could become a lawyer. Your mother destroyed her lungs in textile mills to pay for your education, and this is your definition of humane?" A heavy silence fell, broken only by the thudding of rain on umbrellas and the rhythmic hiss of Julia's oxygen. Bradford handed Arthur a set of rusty keys. "Grandfather's old mining claim in the Rockies. It's all we can offer. The cabin's still standing, mostly. Maybe the mountain air will help Mom's breathing." His expression softened momentarily. "But Dad, seriously, that dog won't survive a winter up there. He's old, just like..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. "Just like you." Arthur's voice hardened into something unfamiliar even to himself. "Ranger goes where we go. He's not negotiable." The children exchanged looks, part exasperation, part relief at having done the minimum. As they drove away in their luxury vehicles, Arthur unfolded the note left in the envelope. "We'll visit when we can afford to. Try to understand. P.S. There's a vet clinic 50 miles from the cabin if you insist on keeping the dog." Julia's voice, barely audible, pulled him back to reality. 50 years of marriage, raised 5 children, and this is how our story ends, boy. Ranger whined softly and licked her hand, as if promising it wasn't the end at all. The truck's headlights finally illuminated a weathered sign. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow, founded 1952. As they rounded the final curve, the answer became clear. There was no town, just the skeletal remains of an abandoned mining settlement. The truck's headlights swept across collapsed structures, rusted equipment, and, at the center, their new home. A log cabin with half its roof caved in, windows shattered, porch sagging like a broken jaw. "My God," Arthur whispered. The betrayal, already profound, deepened as he realized the true nature of their children's gift. Ranger barked once, sharply, and leapt from the truck the moment Arthur opened his door. Instead of running off into the wilderness, a fear that had haunted Arthur throughout the journey, the dog began methodically circling the property, nose to the ground, as if establishing a perimeter. "What's he doing?" Julia asked, her breath creating ghost-like puffs in the freezing air. "Being smarter than our children, Arthur muttered. He's checking if it's safe. They had $847 in cash, canned goods for perhaps a week, Julia's critical medications that would run out in 12 days, and a 50-pound bag of dog food that had seemed adequate in the valley but now felt preciously finite at 8,500 feet elevation. Inside the cabin, the devastation was complete. The collapsed section had allowed snow to create drifts across what might have been a living room. A rusted wood stove listed to one side, its pipe disconnected. The kitchenette sink had long ago separated from the wall, and animal droppings suggested multiple species had claimed the space over the years. Arthur sank onto an overturned crate, the enormity of their situation crushing down on him like the weight of the mountain itself. "Evie, I've failed you. I gave them everything. And now," he looked at Ranger, who was shivering despite his thick coat. Maybe they were right about bringing him. Julia's oxygen concentrator struggled in the thin air as she moved slowly to his side. She took his weathered hand while scratching behind Ranger's ears with her free hand. "Arthur Whitlock, we survived the Great Recession, raised 5 children on factory wages, and buried our parents with dignity. The 3 of us aren't done yet." Her eyes sparked with a determination he hadn't seen since her diagnosis. "Besides," she continued, pointing to the faded welcome sign barely visible through the broken window, "we're not the first ones to start over in these mountains. And Ranger here, he's got more loyalty in one paw than our children showed in 50 years. As if on cue, Ranger suddenly perked up, ears forward, looking toward the darkness beyond the broken door. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive, but alert. "What is it, boy?" Arthur followed the dog's intense gaze but saw nothing but swirling snow. "He's always been able to sense things we can't. Maybe that's exactly what we need up here." Ranger padded to the door and stood waiting, his posture clear. "Follow me." Against all logic, Arthur found himself struggling. Where's he going? It's freezing out there. But Julia was already reaching for her oxygen tank. "I trust him more than I trust our children right now. Let's see what he's found." They followed Ranger through the snow to what appeared to be a root cellar 20 yards from the main cabin. The door was nearly buried, but the dog began digging with purpose, clearing away snow until Arthur could pull the frozen handle. Inside, illuminated by Arthur's flashlight, was a concrete room stocked with preserved jars, decades old but still sealed, along with stacks of firewood, basic tools, and most surprisingly, a small propane heater with 2 full tanks. "Someone prepared for winter," Arthur whispered. "Not someone," Julia corrected, pointing to initials carved into the wall. "E.W. 1953. Your grandfather, Emmett Whitlock." Ranger sat beside them, tail sweeping the dusty floor, his expression almost smug. "Good boy," Arthur whispered. "Very good boy." That night, they slept in the truck with the propane heater running intermittently and Ranger sandwiched between them for warmth. Outside, the blizzard howled its displeasure at their survival, but for the first time since leaving their home, Arthur slept without despair crushing his chest. In the morning, he awoke to find Ranger sitting alert at the truck's window, staring intently at the mountain slope behind the cabin. The storm had passed, revealing a landscape both brutal and breathtaking. Frost-covered pines stood sentinel around the clearing, and the rising sun transformed the snow-covered peaks into flame-tipped monuments. "What do you see, boy?" Arthur asked. Ranger whined softly and pawed at the window. Beside him, Julia stirred. Her breathing seemed worse this morning, the altitude taking its toll. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know." Ranger's fixated on something up there. Arthur squinted, seeing nothing unusual among the trees and rocks. "Check his bowl," Julia suggested, but Ranger's food and water remained untouched. The dog continued staring at the mountainside with unwavering focus. Later, as Arthur assessed the cabin's damage, calculating what might be salvageable, Ranger maintained his vigilance. The dog would periodically circle the property, nose to the ground, then return to stare at the same section of mountainside. By midday, the pattern became too obvious to ignore. "I think he wants us to follow him," Arthur said finally. "I don't know if I can make that climb." Arthur faced an impossible choice. follow Ranger's insistent guidance, or stay with Julia, whose every breath was a struggle. "You both stay here," he decided. "I'll see what's got him so worked up." But Ranger wouldn't budge without Julia. When Arthur tried to leave alone, the dog planted himself beside Julia, refusing to move. "He won't leave you," Arthur realized. "Whatever's up there, he thinks you need to see it too." Determination flickered across Julia's face, the same expression she'd worn when doctors told her she'd never see their youngest daughter graduate. She'd proven them wrong then. "Help me with the portable tank," she said, reaching for the smaller oxygen supply they reserved for emergencies. The climb was excruciating. Every few yards, Julia needed to rest, leaning against trees or rocks, her breathing shallow and rapid despite the oxygen. Arthur's heart clenched, watching her struggle, but Ranger remained patient, waiting whenever they stopped, then urging them forward with soft woofs when Julia had recovered enough to continue. They had climbed perhaps a quarter-mile when Ranger darted ahead, disappearing behind a cluster of boulders. His excited barking echoed against the mountainside. "Ranger," Arthur called. "What have you found, boy?" When they rounded the boulders, the sight stopped them both. Nestled in a natural depression was a steaming pool about 30 feet across, its waters crystal clear and lined with smooth stones. Despite the freezing temperature, wisps of vapor rose from the surface, creating a mystical haze in the winter sunlight. "A hot spring," Arthur breathed, astonishment momentarily erasing his exhaustion. Ranger stood proudly at the pool's edge, tail wagging, clearly pleased with himself. He dipped one paw in the water, then looked back at them expectantly. Julia's scientific mind, the one that had helped her children with science projects and math homework for decades, sparked to life. Thermal activity, probably mineral-rich. People pay fortunes at spas for waters like this. Arthur helped her to the edge where she could sit on a flat rock. She trailed her fingers through the water, then raised them to her face. "It smells like my grandmother's mineral supplements. Sulfur, magnesium maybe." Ranger barked once, then did something extraordinary. He began digging at a spot several feet from the pool's edge. Within moments, his paws uncovered a metal corner protruding from the earth. Arthur knelt beside him, brushing away soil and pine needles to reveal a rusted metal box about the size of a large book. Stenciled across its lid were the faded words, "E. Whitlock, 1953. "Another gift from your grandfather," Julia whispered. Inside the waterproof container, they found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact, along with geological surveys, old letters, and a faded photograph. The image showed a man, unmistakably Arthur's grandfather, Emmett, standing beside the very same pool. Next to him sat a German shepherd that looked remarkably like Ranger, its posture alert and proud. On the back of the photo, handwritten in faded ink, "God's pharmacy heals what medicine cannot." Rex found it first, like dogs always do. Ranger nosed at the photo, then at Arthur, his intelligent eyes seeming to say, "History repeats itself." As the winter sun began its early descent, Julia removed her shoes and, with Arthur's help, slipped her feet into the warm waters. The effect was almost immediate, her tight expression relaxed, the lines of pain around her mouth softening. It feels like it's reaching inside me," she murmured, "like breathing underwater, but in a good way." By the time darkness threatened, forcing them to head back to the cabin, Julia walked with noticeably less effort. Her breathing, while still labored, had a different quality, less desperate, more rhythmic. That night, huddled in the truck with Emmett's journal open between them, they read by flashlight about the spring's remarkable properties. The water runs warm even in winter. Sarah's arthritis disappeared after 3 months of soaking. The children's skin cleared. Rex led us to it on our 3rd day here, like he knew what we needed. I believe this place chose us, not the other way around. Ranger lay across their feet, occasionally raising his head when his name, or perhaps Rex's, was mentioned, as if the stories were familiar to him on some ancestral level. Deeper in the journal, they found entries about multiple pools, each with different mineral compositions, treating different ailments. There were notes about locals who came secretly for treatments, about offers from pharmaceutical companies, one letter offering $50,000 in 1953, nearly $500,000 in today's money, and about Emmett's decision to keep the springs a family secret. The final entry, dated a month before Emmett's death, read, "The mountain keeps its secrets for those who need them most. Rex's pups have scattered across the country, but I believe one will return someday when the springs are needed again. The dogs remember what humans forget." Arthur looked at Ranger. "You knew," he whispered. "Somehow you knew." Julia's hand found Arthur's. "Our children gave us nothing," she said softly. "But maybe their nothing is everything we need." Dawn arrived with Arctic brilliance, sunlight refracting through ice crystals to cast prism-like patterns across the snow. Arthur awoke stiff from another night in the truck, but with a clarity of purpose that had eluded him since retirement. Beside him, Julia slept more peacefully than she had in months, her breathing less labored despite the night without her concentrator, which had finally run out of power. Ranger had already left the truck and stood alertly by the cabin, as if waiting for the workday to begin. When Arthur emerged, stretching his aching back, the dog trotted to him and nudged his hand, then looked pointedly at the collapsed roof. "You're right," Arthur murmured. "We can't live in the truck forever." His first instinct was to call for help, perhaps a contractor from the nearest town. Then reality crashed back. They had less than $850 to their name, no cell service, and a road that would likely remain impassable for weeks. Arthur squared his shoulders and looked at the cabin with new eyes, not as a hopeless wreck, but as a project. For 35 years, he'd maintained industrial equipment at the factory, improvising repairs when parts weren't available, keeping ancient machinery running through sheer ingenuity. "This is just a big machine that doesn't move," he told Ranger, who tilted his head as if considering this perspective. Julia emerged from the truck. "I feel different," she said wonderingly, touching her chest, "like something loosened in here overnight." While Arthur had seen the spring as their secret, something to enjoy privately, Julia immediately grasped its potential. "We need to make the cabin livable," she declared, "and then create a path to the spring that I can manage daily." It became their first project, a walking path from cabin to spring, lined with stones and reinforced with salvaged timber from collapsed outbuildings. Ranger helped by dragging smaller branches in his teeth, dropping them precisely where needed, then waiting for approval before retrieving more. Arthur had forgotten the satisfaction of physical labor, not the grinding factory work that had worn down his body, but purposeful creation. Each placed stone and leveled section of path represented progress, tangible and immediate. By the third day, Julia could make the journey to the spring with minimal assistance, and each soak seemed to strengthen her further. The portable oxygen tank, which had been her constant companion, now stayed behind more often than not. "The minerals," she explained, reading from Emmett's journal. "They're reducing the inflammation in my lungs. Listen to this." He writes about a mining accident in '55 where 3 men with coal dust in their lungs recovered after 2 months of daily soaking. The cabin itself proved more challenging. The collapsed section had allowed water damage to weaken the remaining structure. Arthur, working methodically with tools salvaged from Emmett's root cellar, removed the damaged sections before they could compromise the foundation. "Grandfather built this place to last," Arthur noted. "The core structure is still solid. It's just the additions that failed." Ranger showed an uncanny ability to locate useful materials. The dog would disappear into the surrounding forest or abandoned mining structures, returning to bark insistently until Arthur or Julia followed him. His discoveries included a cache of preserved lumber in a fallen storage shed, intact windows in the mine supervisor's office, and most valuable, solar panels from a more recent installation, likely an attempt at modernization before the settlement was abandoned. "How does he know what we need?" Julia wondered. "Maybe he can smell Grandpa's scent on things," Arthur suggested, though he didn't entirely believe it. The dog's most remarkable discovery came 2 weeks into their renovation efforts. Arthur had been struggling to devise a heating solution beyond the wood stove, concerned about Julia's lungs with wood smoke. Ranger disappeared for nearly 3 hours, returning muddy and excited, barking at them until they followed him to what appeared to be a maintenance shed half buried in the hillside. Inside, beneath decades of dust and debris, they found an intact propane heating system, newer than the original settlement, likely installed during a brief revival attempt in the 1980 seconds. The tanks were empty, but the system itself, with some cleaning and minor repairs, could be made functional again. "This is exactly what we needed," Arthur breathed, examining the heater. That evening, as Julia soaked her feet in a small basin of spring water they'd carried back to the truck, she made a startling observation. "Arthur, look at this." She extended her legs, pulling up her pant legs to reveal her ankles. The edema is gone. For years, Julia's ankles had swollen painfully by day's end, a side effect of her heart medication. Now they looked normal, the skin smooth instead of taut and shiny. "And that's not all," she continued. "My morning stiffness is better. I can make a fist without my knuckles screaming," she demonstrated, curling her fingers into a tight ball, something that had been impossible without pain for nearly a decade. Arthur sat heavily on an overturned crate. "The springs," he said, "they're really healing you. Not just me." Julia pointed to his hands, which had been working tirelessly on repairs. "You've been carrying lumber, swinging hammers, kneeling on hard surfaces. When's the last time you took your arthritis medication?" Arthur blinked in surprise. His prescription bottle remained unopened in their medical kit. He flexed his fingers experimentally, then rotated his perpetually sore shoulder. The familiar pain was noticeably duller. "I thought it was just keeping busy. Distraction." "It's the springs," Julia insisted. "You've been washing up in the water I bring back every day. And look at Ranger." The dog, hearing his name, raised his head. His eyes were clear and bright. His movements throughout the day had been energetic, despite the high altitude and his advanced age. Even the gray around his muzzle seemed less pronounced. Arthur turned to Emmett's journal with renewed interest. The entries about the spring's healing properties, which he'd initially dismissed as exaggeration or wishful thinking, now demanded closer examination. One passage particularly caught his attention. Each pool has its own signature. The North Spring eases bones and joints. The Eastern Pool heals skin and wounds. The largest, by the lightning-struck pine, seems to help breathing and heart troubles. Rex always leads visitors to the right waters, as if he can sense what ails them. "Multiple springs," Arthur murmured. "Ranger only showed us one." Julia's eyes lit up. "The one that would help me breathe, the one we needed most urgently." The next morning, they followed Ranger back to the first spring, but this time, instead of settling in for Julia's usual soak, Arthur asked, "Can you show us the others, boy? The other springs?" Ranger's ears perked forward. He circled the familiar pool once, then set off along the mountainside, frequently looking back to ensure they followed. The path was more challenging, cutting across rather than up the slope, and Arthur supported Julia carefully over rough terrain. After 15 minutes, Ranger disappeared behind a rock formation. When they caught up, they found him sitting beside a second steaming pool, smaller than the first but bordered by unusual reddish stones. "The Eastern Pool," Arthur breathed, recalling the journal's description, "for skin and wounds." This water had a slightly different scent, less sulfuric, with hints of iron. Arthur dipped his hand in, feeling the smooth, almost silky texture. On impulse, he submerged a small cut he'd gotten while working on the roof, watching in amazement as the angry red inflammation visibly receded within minutes. Ranger allowed them only a brief inspection before moving on, leading them to a third pool hidden in a grove of aspen trees. This one, true to Emmett's description, sat beside a massive lightning-scarred pine that had somehow survived the strike that split it nearly in half. The water here had yet another character, clear but with a bluish tint and a distinct mineral aroma. 3 distinct springs, 3 different mineral compositions. Julia marveled, her scientific mind cataloging the differences, each with specific healing properties. But Ranger wasn't finished. He led them to a 4th pool they hadn't found mentioned in the journal, a tiny spring, barely 3 feet across, nestled against the mountain face and lined with unusual black stones. The water here was so clear it was almost invisible, with no steam despite its warmth. "This one's not in the journal," Arthur said. "Maybe it appeared after Emmett's time? Thermal activity can change." She dipped her fingers in, then touched them to her lips thoughtfully. "It tastes different, sweeter somehow." Ranger approached this pool differently. Instead of his usual confident posture, he lay down beside it, resting his chin on the edge as if in reverence. When Arthur moved to touch the water again, the dog gave a soft warning growl. "I think he's saying this one is special," Julia interpreted, "to be respected." By the time they returned to the cabin, both were exhausted but exhilarated by their discoveries. The full extent of their inheritance was becoming clear, not just a dilapidated cabin, but a natural pharmacy of healing waters. "Our children thought they were sending us to die in the wilderness," Julia said, "but I think they accidentally sent us to the one place that could save us. The question is, what do we do with this gift?" For the next week, they established a routine. Mornings were spent on cabin repairs, with Arthur focusing on structural work, while Julia, growing stronger daily, organized their supplies and began clearing ground for a spring garden. Afternoons included a trip to the springs, with Ranger always leading them to whichever pool seemed most needed that day. The cabin gradually transformed from ruin to refuge. Arthur repaired the roof using salvaged corrugated metal from abandoned mining structures. He installed the recovered windows, sealing them against mountain winds. The solar panels, once cleaned and properly positioned, provided enough power for basic lighting and to charge Julia's medical equipment. Their most ambitious project was a gravity-fed water system that Arthur designed using materials from the mining operation's old water supply. A series of pipes and filters brought clean mountain water directly into the cabin, where an improvised tank could be heated by the wood stove for washing. Ranger, incredibly, seemed to understand the purpose of each improvement, often discovering exactly the materials Arthur needed before he even searched for them. When Arthur puzzled over how to insulate the north wall, Ranger disappeared for hours, returning to lead him to an abandoned storage facility containing industrial insulation materials. "It's like he can read my mind," Arthur told Julia one evening. "Or your grandfather's," she suggested. "Maybe he left caches of supplies all over the settlement, and Ranger can somehow sense them." Their physical changes were becoming impossible to ignore. Julia, who had needed oxygen support for even the slightest exertion, now moved about the cabin freely. Her persistent cough had diminished, and her complexion had transformed from gray to pink. Arthur's arthritic pain had receded so dramatically that he could kneel on the cabin floor to install baseboard heaters, something that would have been excruciating just weeks before. Even Ranger showed remarkable vitality for a 9-year-old dog. His coat gleamed, his eyes were bright, and he bounded through deep snow with the energy of a much younger animal. "The springs are healing all of us," Julia observed. Their isolation remained complete. The access road still buried under snow, no cell signal, no visitors. Yet instead of the desperate loneliness they had feared, they found a surprising contentment in their daily routines and small victories. 1 month after their arrival, Arthur uncovered a ham radio in the mine supervisor's office. With some tinkering and parts salvaged from other equipment, he managed to get it working. They made contact with a ranger station 30 miles away, establishing their presence and location in case of emergency, but declined offers of rescue. "We're doing just fine," Arthur told the surprised ranger. "Just letting you know we're here." That night, they made a momentous decision. Using the journal as reference, they would formalize what had begun instinctively, creating a systematic approach to using the spring's healing properties. Julia, drawing on her lifelong love of gardening, designed terraced pools that would capture the different spring waters, making them more accessible. Arthur began sketching plans for simple changing shelters and resting areas. Even Ranger participated, using his uncanny ability to find materials and his seemingly instinctual knowledge of which terrain could be modified without disturbing the spring's flow. 6 weeks after arriving as exiles, they stood together surveying their progress. The cabin now stood solid and weathertight, with a proper bed inside instead of the truck seats they'd initially relied on. A modest garden plot was prepared for spring planting, using soil enriched with minerals from the springs. The first terraced pool was nearly complete, lined with stones that Ranger had helped select, each chosen with what seemed like deliberate care for its size and shape. "We came here with nothing," Arthur said. "Now I feel richer than I ever did back home." Julia leaned into his embrace. "Our children threw us away like worn-out tools, but the mountain welcomed us like family." Ranger sat alert beside them, his gaze fixed on the mountainside where the springs awaited their next visit. In the fading light, his profile looked remarkably like the dog in Emmett's photograph, a guardian across generations, leading his humans to healing. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Julia made an entry in the journal they had started, continuing the legacy Emmett began. Day 42 at Raven's Hollow. Arthur sleeps without pain medication for the first time in 15 years. My oxygen concentrator sits unused in the corner. Ranger grows more vibrant each day. The waters heal our bodies, but it's the purpose that heals our spirits. We thought our story was ending. Instead, it's just beginning. Spring arrived suddenly in the high country, as if winter had simply surrendered overnight. Snow retreated up the mountainside, revealing meadows that erupted into wildflowers with almost magical speed. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the transformation of Raven's Hollow itself. What had been a collapsed cabin in a ghost town was now an inviting dwelling at the center of a carefully tended property. Arthur had expanded beyond basic repairs, adding a covered porch where Julia could sit in the sun, monitoring her thriving garden. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, while a stone chimney, rebuilt using techniques Arthur had learned from Emmett's journals, anchored the western wall. Ranger had established himself as more than a pet. He was a working partner in their daily lives. The dog had developed a morning routine of patrolling the property perimeter, alerting them to wildlife, deer, elk, and occasionally a black bear that he warned away with strategic barking. Julia's garden defied the conventional wisdom about high altitude growing. Using water from the springs to irrigate, she produced vegetables of extraordinary size and vigor. Lettuces grew lush and sweet, root vegetables reached maturity in half the expected time, and herbs flourished with intensified aromas and flavors. "It's the mineral content," she explained to Arthur, examining soil samples in jars of water. "These springs are feeding the plants just like they're feeding us." "I feel 30 years younger," he told Julia one evening as they soaked their feet in spring water carried to the cabin. "Like I've been given a second chance at the prime of my life. It's like the clock is running backwards," she marveled, examining her reflection in the polished metal mirror Arthur had fashioned. Ranger, too, showed the spring's effects. His muzzle, which had been heavily grayed when they arrived, now showed more black than white. His coat gleamed with health, and his energy seemed limitless as he bounded up and down the mountainside, often carrying tools or materials in a special harness Arthur had designed. The springs themselves had been transformed under their stewardship. Following Emmett's journals and guided by Ranger's inexplicable knowledge, Arthur constructed proper pools at each site, using stone and salvaged lumber to create soaking areas of varying depths and temperatures. Each spring now featured specific amenities based on its properties. The breathing spring, with its effects on respiratory health, included a covered meditation platform where visitors could sit and inhale the mineral-rich steam. The joint spring was surrounded by comfortable benches with backing for proper support. The skin spring featured a gradual entry pool where one could submerge completely, while the smallest spring, the reverence spring, as they'd come to call it, remained minimally developed, accessible only by a simple stone path. Julia maintained meticulous records, combining Emmett's notes with their own observations. She created a catalog of ailments and which springs seemed most effective for each, noting optimal soaking times, water temperatures, and complementary treatments. One remarkable discovery came when Ranger began bringing injured wildlife to specific springs. A fox with a damaged paw was gently herded to the skin spring. A deer with labored breathing found itself guided to the respiratory pool. Most dramatically, an injured eagle that had crashed into their garden was carefully approached by Ranger, who stood guard while Arthur, following the dog's clear signals, bathed the bird's damaged wing in water from the skin spring. Within days, the eagle had recovered enough to fly away. He's not just finding things we need, Arthur realized, watching Ranger guide a limping rabbit to the edge of the joint spring. He's a healer in his own right. The journal entries from this period reflected their growing understanding of Ravens Hollow's special nature. Day 78. Julia's lung capacity now measures 89% of normal, a medical impossibility according to her last doctor. Arthur's arthritis has reversed to the point that X-rays would likely show regeneration in the joint cartilage. Ranger shows abilities that defy explanation. He seems to diagnose ailments in both humans and animals, guiding each to the appropriate spring. We are witnessing miracles daily, yet they feel as natural as sunrise. Their isolation gradually decreased as the mountain roads cleared. On their infrequent trips to the nearest town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves, they met locals who initially regarded them with the suspicion typically reserved for outsiders in remote communities. However, Ranger's presence served as an unexpected bridge. The dog's exceptional behavior and obvious intelligence drew admiration, opening conversations that might otherwise have remained closed. Arthur and Julia were careful about what they shared, mentioning only that they were caretaking family property and enjoyed the mountain's healthy environment. Their first unplanned visitor arrived in early summer, a local hunter named Harold Jensen, who appeared at their clearing, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his face contorted with pain. The truck broke down 3 miles back, he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the access road. Hip's been giving me hell. Saw your smoke and hoped you might have a phone. Before Arthur could explain their lack of phone service, Ranger approached the stranger, circling him slowly, nose working. Then, with deliberate purpose, the dog tugged at Harold's pant leg before trotting toward the path leading to the joint spring. Your dog wants something, Harold observed. He wants to show you something, Julia said carefully. If you'd like to follow him, that is. Afterward, Arthur can drive you to your truck and help get it running. Harold, either from pain or curiosity, agreed. Ranger led the procession up the now well-established path, pausing frequently to ensure the limping man kept pace. When they reached the joint spring, the dog sat expectantly at the edge of the soaking pool Arthur had built. What's this? Harold asked. Natural hot spring, Arthur explained. Mineral-rich. Good for aches and pains. Like a spa? Harold looked doubtful. More like old-time medicine, Julia offered. The kind your grandparents might have used before pharmaceuticals took over. Perhaps it was the pain, or perhaps the simple, straightforward way they presented the opportunity. But Harold eventually lowered himself to a bench and, with Arthur's assistance, removed his boots and rolled up his pants to immerse his legs in the warm water. The effect wasn't instantaneous, but came gradually over 20 minutes. Harold's tight expression softened, his rigid posture relaxed, and eventually he spoke. Been to 3 specialists about this hip, he said. Cortisone shots, physical therapy, talk of replacement surgery. He moved his leg experimentally in the water. This feels better than anything they tried. When Harold finally emerged from the pool, he walked to his bench with noticeably less difficulty. What is this place? He asked. And how'd your dog know what I needed? We're still figuring that out ourselves. The springs have different properties. Ranger seems to know which one helps which problem. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Had a bird dog once that could find quail where no other hunter could. Some animals just know things we don't. He paused, then asked, would it be imposing to come back sometime? For my hip? Thus began a careful expansion of Ravens Hollow's reach. Harold returned, initially alone, then with his wife Margaret, whose arthritis responded similarly well to the joint spring. They brought occasional gifts, homemade preserves, fresh game, useful tools, but more importantly, they brought discretion. They understood, without being told, that the springs were a private matter, not for general discussion. Through Harold and Margaret, a small network of local residents with chronic health issues began to make occasional pilgrimages to the springs. Ranger greeted each visitor with the same assessment routine, inevitably guiding them to whichever spring best matched their needs. Arthur and Julia established simple guidelines: visits by appointment only, no commercial activity, and a request for contributions to maintenance rather than fees. These contributions, sometimes monetary, often practical goods or services, allowed them to enhance the facilities without depleting their minimal savings. By midsummer, their routine had expanded to include visitor days 3 times weekly. Arthur would meet guests at the main road in their refurbished truck, repaired using parts Ranger had unearthed from abandoned vehicles around the settlement, while Julia prepared the springs and maintained her records. Ranger's role evolved beyond guide and diagnostician. He became an integral part of the healing process itself. Visitors reported that his presence beside them during soaking sessions brought a sense of calm that enhanced the water's effects. For visitors with emotional trauma or anxiety, the dog would sometimes simply rest his head on their lap, his steady gaze and rhythmic breathing seeming to ground them in the present moment. One notable case involved a local teenager, brought by Harold, who suffered debilitating panic attacks following a car accident. Medication had left the boy foggy and withdrawn, but after 3 sessions at the breathing spring with Ranger lying pressed against his side, he reported his first attack-free week in months. "That dog's worth his weight in gold," Harold declared. "Some folks pay hundreds an hour for therapy that doesn't work half as well." Their operation remained small and deliberately under the radar, catering primarily to locals with chronic conditions that conventional medicine had failed to resolve. They accepted no more than 8 visitors on any day, maintaining the peaceful atmosphere they'd come to value. The transformative power of the springs wasn't limited to physical healing. Arthur and Julia discovered that their exile, initially seen as a cruel abandonment, had become a profound gift. Free from the expectations and demands that had defined their lives, they found themselves growing in unexpected ways. Arthur, always practical and reserved, discovered a creative side through his ongoing improvements to the springs. His walkways and shelters evolved beyond functionality to incorporate beautiful design elements: hand-carved railings, mosaic stone patterns, benches positioned to capture perfect views of the mountains. Julia, whose identity had been so wrapped up in motherhood and domestic duties, blossomed as a researcher and healer. Her methodical documentation of the spring's effects became a valuable reference, while her intuitive understanding of visitors' needs complemented Ranger's diagnostic abilities. Together, they had created something neither could have envisioned: a sanctuary where healing occurred on multiple levels. Physical ailments improved, certainly, but visitors also spoke of emotional shifts, renewed purpose, and spiritual insights gained during their time at the springs. "We thought our useful lives were over," Arthur reflected one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in amber and gold. "Instead, we're doing more meaningful work than ever before." Julia nodded. "Our children saw us as a burden to be discarded. Now we're a blessing to people who truly appreciate us." Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears perked toward the access road. His posture wasn't alarmed but alert, a familiar visitor approaching. Minutes later, Harold's truck appeared, but instead of Harold or Margaret, a slender woman in her early 60s stepped out. She moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable in the outdoors, and a professional camera hung from a strap around her neck. "That's Dr. Sarah Brennan," Julia murmured, recognizing her from the local clinic they'd visited for basic supplies. "Harold mentioned she was interested in the springs, but I didn't think she'd come herself." Ranger rose, trotting down to meet the newcomer with his customary assessment routine. After circling her once, he did something unexpected. He barked once, sharply, then ran back to Arthur and Julia before returning to guide Dr. Brennan up the path. "He's never done that before," Arthur observed, puzzled. "It's almost like he's announcing her," Julia suggested. Dr. Brennan approached with an open, curious expression. "Harold Jensen has been raving about your healing springs for weeks," she said. "As the only doctor within 50 miles, I notice when my patients start canceling follow-up appointments because they're feeling better." Arthur stiffened slightly, concerned about potential trouble, but Dr. Brennan quickly continued. "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here because I'm fascinated, and because I have my own issues that conventional medicine hasn't resolved." She gestured to her right hand, which showed the characteristic swelling of rheumatoid arthritis. 20 years of practicing veterinary medicine has taken its toll. The irony of spending my career healing animals only to find myself increasingly unable to perform surgeries isn't lost on me. Ranger circled back, gently nosing Dr. Brennan's hand before looking pointedly at the path leading to the joint spring. "Your dog is remarkable," she observed. Harold mentioned his diagnostic abilities. I was skeptical, but seeing it firsthand is impressive. She knelt to examine Ranger more closely, her veterinarian's training evident in how she approached him. "German Shepherd mix, about 9 years old," she estimated, "though he moves like a much younger dog." "He's been rejuvenated by the springs, just like we have," Julia explained. "We were all in poor health when we arrived." Dr. Brennan's visit became a turning point in their understanding of Ravens Hollow's potential. As both a doctor and scientist, she brought valuable perspective to their observations. After experiencing the joint spring's effects on her arthritic hand, she regained full range of motion within 3 visits. She proposed a more systematic documentation process. "What you've stumbled upon here deserves proper study," she told them. "Not to commercialize it, but to understand it. These effects defy conventional medical explanation." With Dr. Brennan's guidance, they began collecting more detailed data, before and after measurements, comparative photographs, specific timelines of improvement. Her professional network provided access to testing equipment that could analyze the spring's mineral content with precision. Their homemade methods couldn't match. Most significantly, Dr. Brennan took a special interest in Ranger. Her veterinary background allowed her to observe nuances in his behavior that even Arthur and Julia had missed. "He's not just sensing physical ailments," she explained. "He's responding to emotional states as well. When that man with the back pain arrived angry about his job, Ranger didn't take him to the joint spring until after he'd calmed down. It's as if he knows the healing won't be as effective if the person is emotionally agitated." She began documenting Ranger's interactions systematically, creating a behavioral profile that revealed patterns even the dog's devoted owners hadn't fully recognized. Ranger adjusted his approach based on visitors' anxiety levels, mobility limitations, and even their receptiveness to the experience. For skeptical visitors, he demonstrated more persistence. For those who were fearful, he became gentler and more attentive. "In 35 years of veterinary practice, I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Brennan admitted. Her most startling discovery came when she performed a full health assessment on Ranger. Blood work, joint mobility tests, and cognitive evaluations all showed results typical of a dog half his age. The regenerative effects of these springs on canine physiology are unprecedented, she told Arthur and Julia. His cellular markers show actual age reversal, not just symptom improvement. Whatever's happening in these waters is altering biology at a fundamental level, with this scientific validation of what they'd observed. Intuitively, Arthur and Julia found their perspective shifting. What had begun as personal healing, then expanded to helping neighbors, now revealed itself as potentially groundbreaking. "We need to protect this place," Arthur said one evening as they discussed Dr. Brennan's findings. "If the wrong people learned about waters that can reverse aging and heal chronic conditions," Julia nodded solemnly, "pharmaceutical companies would be all over it. Developers would turn it into an exclusive resort. Everything that makes it special would be commercialized or destroyed." Their conversation was interrupted by Ranger, who suddenly stood at attention, staring down the access road with unusual intensity. His posture wasn't his normal greeting for expected visitors, nor was it his alert for wildlife. There was something almost wary in his stance. "Someone's coming," Arthur said, reaching for binoculars. Through the lenses, he spotted a luxury SUV navigating the rough road with obvious difficulty. Even at a distance, the vehicle's gleaming black exterior and city cleanliness stood out as foreign to the mountain environment. Ranger moved to stand between Arthur and Julia, his body language protective rather than welcoming. A low rumble built in his chest as the SUV drew closer. "I don't like this," Julia murmured. "We don't have visitors scheduled today." As the SUV parked beside their truck, the driver's door opened to reveal a face they hadn't seen in nearly 6 months. Their eldest son, Bradford, impeccably dressed in casual luxury attire that nonetheless managed to look completely out of place in the mountain setting. Ranger's growl deepened, and Arthur placed a restraining hand on the dog's collar. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Bradford surveyed the transformed property with undisguised shock. His eyes moved from the renovated cabin to the terraced garden, the solar array, and the carefully maintained paths leading up the mountainside. "Dad? Mom?" he called. "Is that really you?" Julia stepped forward. "Hello, Bradford. This is an unexpected visit," he approached slowly. "You both look incredible. When you last saw us, we were broken and discarded," Arthur finished, his voice level but firm. "What brings you to Raven's Hollow after 6 months of silence? We've been trying to reach you for weeks. No phone service, no response to letters." He gestured to the thriving homestead around them. "Clearly, you've been busy. What exactly have you created up here?" Before Arthur could respond, the passenger door opened and Diana emerged, legal portfolio in hand as always. She was followed by their son Kevin and Bradford's wife Gracie, who eyed the rustic surroundings with poorly concealed distaste. Ranger's protective stance intensified, his body shifting subtly to place himself more directly between the elderly couple and their approaching children. "My God," Diana exclaimed. "Mom, you're not using oxygen. And your hair, it's got color again." "The mountain air agrees with us," Julia replied. Gracie approached, her designer hiking boots pristine and impractical. "And the dog survived," she observed with surprise, maintaining a safe distance from Ranger. "Why are you here?" he asked directly, making no move to embrace his children or invite them into the home he'd rebuilt with his own hands. Bradford exchanged glances with Diana before, answering, "We've been hearing stories about miraculous healing springs, about an elderly couple who've created some kind of wellness retreat, about a remarkable therapy dog who guides people to exactly what they need." He paused, looking pointedly at Ranger. "Sound familiar?" The atmosphere tensed as the two groups faced each other. The abandoned parents who had transformed exile into purpose, and the children who had discarded them only to return when something of value appeared. The standoff lingered, tension stretching between parents and children like an invisible barrier. Ranger remained positioned protectively, his intelligent eyes moving from one visitor to the next with clear assessment. "May we sit down and talk?" Bradford finally asked. Arthur hesitated. "The porch, not inside. You've done incredible things here," Diana began, her legal training evident in her careful phrasing. "The transformation is remarkable. Both of you look healthier than you have in years," Kevin added, his tone more genuinely admiring than his siblings's. "When we last saw you, Mom, you could barely walk from the house to the car." Julia nodded. "Raven's Hollow has been good for us." "Let's not dance around this," Bradford interjected. "We've been hearing stories from locals in town. They're calling this place a miracle spring. They say you've created some kind of healing sanctuary, and that your dog," he gestured toward Ranger, who watched him unblinkingly, "has become some kind of local legend." "People talk," Arthur replied. "Mountain communities enjoy their stories." Gracie leaned forward. "But these aren't just stories, are they? You're running some kind of resort operation. And this dog, he looks incredible. This changes everything." Diana opened her portfolio, extracting documents with practiced efficiency. "We've been researching the mineral rights and water rights attached to this property. The original claim from 1952 includes extensive subsurface rights that could be quite valuable with the proper development." "Development?" Julia's voice sharpened. "This isn't a commercial venture." "But it could be," Bradford countered. A wellness resort in this setting with documented healing properties and the unique angle of a therapy dog, it's marketing gold. Kevin, who had been quieter than his siblings, finally spoke up. I could run the business side. Turn this into a real wellness resort. Market the dog angle. People love animal therapy stories. That dog's become quite the celebrity, Gracie added. There are Instagram accounts dedicated to him. We could monetize that. Where were you when your mother couldn't breathe? When we had $847 and a collapsed roof? When we thought we might lose Ranger because we couldn't afford veterinary care? Julia, still carrying her portable oxygen tank out of habit rather than necessity, stood with Ranger pressed against her leg. You abandoned us to die. We chose to live. All three of us. Bradford recovered quickly. We made mistakes, Dad. We were trying to do what we thought was best for everyone. For everyone? Arthur repeated. Or for yourselves? We're family, Bradford insisted. This could benefit everyone. Obviously, the dog is doing well here too. Kevin, perhaps sensing the rift, tried a different approach. Mom, Dad, you've built something amazing, but you're not getting any younger. You need our help to manage this properly. Arthur stood abruptly, disappearing into the cabin and returning moments later with a folder of his own. He extracted several legal documents and handed them to Diana. As a lawyer, you'll appreciate this. I've transferred all mineral and water rights to the Ravens Hollow Healing Foundation, a nonprofit established last month. Your mother, myself, and interestingly enough, Ranger are all listed as trustees for life. Diana scanned the documents with professional rapidity. You can't make a dog a trustee. Actually, came a new voice from the path leading up from the main road. In Colorado, you can designate an animal as a beneficiary with human trustees acting on their behalf. It's quite legal, and in this case, quite appropriate. Dr. Brennan approached the gathering, medical bag in hand, her expression pleasant but resolute. Ranger immediately trotted to greet her, his posture relaxing from guard duty to welcome. And you are? Bradford asked. Dr. Sarah Brennan, DVM. She introduced herself. I've been documenting the remarkable healing properties of these springs and Ranger's therapeutic abilities for the past month. She nodded, respectfully to Arthur and Julia. The foundation structure is quite sound legally. I serve as one of the human trustees for Ranger's interests, along with 3 other local professionals who have experienced the spring's benefits firsthand. You've had time to arrange all this, Diana observed, yet you couldn't find time to call your children? You didn't call us either, Julia pointed out. Not until you heard there might be something valuable here. Perhaps, Dr. Brennan suggested diplomatically, this would be a good time for you to experience what your parents have created before continuing this discussion. The spring's perspective-enhancing properties might be beneficial. Bradford looked ready to refuse, but Kevin surprised everyone by standing. I'd like to see these famous springs, if they're really as remarkable as people say. Ranger, who had been watchful throughout the exchange, approached Kevin and circled him once, nose working. After a moment's consideration, the dog gave a soft woof and moved toward the path leading to the respiratory spring. I think he's inviting you to follow him, Arthur explained, his tone softening. The dog, choose which spring? Gracie asked. Ranger has an extraordinary ability to match visitors with the spring that best addresses their specific needs, Dr. Brennan confirmed. We've documented hundreds of cases, and his accuracy is statistically impossible to attribute to chance. Kevin, somewhat hesitantly, followed Ranger up the path. After an awkward moment, Diana and Bradford decided to join the impromptu tour, with Gracie trailing reluctantly behind. Keep an open mind, Dr. Brennan advised. The springs have a way of revealing truths beyond the physical. When they were alone, the doctor turned to Arthur and Julia with concern. I came as quickly as I could when Harold called to warn me about the visitors. Are you all right? We will be, Arthur assured her. Sooner or later, we knew they'd discover what we've built here. The foundation structure should protect the springs from exploitation, Dr. Brennan reassured them, and the local community is firmly behind you. Julia sighed. It was never about legal protection. It was about them seeing us as useful only when we had something they wanted. The visit to the springs produced mixed results. Kevin returned visibly affected, his breathing deeper and his expression thoughtful after soaking his feet in the respiratory pool. Diana maintained her professional composure, but couldn't hide her surprise when the joint pain she'd privately endured for years subsided after 20% 41 minutes at the Spring Ranger selected for her. Bradford remained skeptical, going through the motions at the skin spring but emerging unmoved, or unwilling to admit being moved. Gracie refused to participate entirely, standing at a distance and documenting the experience with her smartphone camera. The potential here is undeniable, Bradford insisted, having shifted from outright commercialization to a more moderate approach. You've created something remarkable, but proper management could help more people while ensuring financial security for the family. We're not interested in financial security as you define it, Arthur responded. Everything is a business, Gracie countered. The question is whether it's managed properly or left to chance. Ranger, who had been lying quietly near Julia's chair, suddenly stood at attention, his gaze fixed on the mountainside. A low, urgent bark escaped him, followed by an insistent whine. Dr. Brennan recognized the behavior immediately. He's sensing a weather change. A significant one. From his reaction, Arthur glanced at the sky, where gathering clouds had begun to darken the late afternoon light. Flash flood risk increases this time of year. When there's heavy rain up top, it all funnels down through the old mining channels. As if confirming his assessment, Ranger barked again, more urgently, and began moving between the gathered humans and the cabin, clearly trying to herd them inside. We should continue this discussion tomorrow, Julia decided, rising from her chair. If Ranger says a storm is coming, we need to secure everything. Fine, Bradford conceded. But this conversation isn't over. Within an hour, the storm's true magnitude became apparent. What began as distant thunder quickly escalated into one of the violent microstorms that occasionally ravaged the high country. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, while lightning transformed the darkened sky into a strobe-lit battleground. The cabin, now solid and weather-tight thanks to Arthur's renovations, became a haven for the reluctantly reunited family. Ranger moved restlessly from window to window, monitoring the storm's progress with obvious concern. He's never this agitated about normal weather, Julia observed. Dr. Brennan, who had decided to remain rather than risk the treacherous road, nodded in agreement. His alertness suggests he's sensing something beyond the obvious storm. As night fell, the rain intensified until it became a solid roar against the roof. Periodic crashes indicated falling trees or dislodged boulders on the mountainside. The comfortable family cabin transformed into a fortress besieged by elemental fury. Near midnight, Ranger suddenly bolted from his monitoring position and rushed to the door, pawing frantically and emitting a series of sharp, demanding barks. "He wants out?" Diana asked, incredulously. "In this? He wants us to follow," Arthur corrected. "Something's wrong." Despite protests from Bradford and Gracie about the foolishness of leaving shelter, Arthur followed Ranger into the deluge, instantly soaked despite his protective clothing. The dog led him not toward the springs as expected, but to the truck parked near the workshop. In the beam of Arthur's flashlight, the reason became immediately clear. A torrent of water was cascading down the mountainside, carving a new channel directly toward the solar array that powered their water pumps and Julia's medical equipment. The flood would destroy it within minutes. With Ranger leading the way, barking encouragement, Arthur managed to disconnect the critical components and move them to higher ground just before the muddy wave swept through, carrying debris and small boulders in its churning path. They returned to the cabin drenched but victorious, only to find Ranger already circling anxiously toward another door. "He's trying to tell us something else," Julia realized. This time, Kevin volunteered to follow, perhaps moved by the dog's obvious intelligence and dedication. Together with Arthur, he trailed Ranger to the garden, where the floodwaters threatened to wash away months of careful cultivation. Working in the pounding rain, they constructed an emergency diversion channel, redirecting the worst of the flow around rather than through Julia's precious plantings. Throughout the night, this pattern repeated. Ranger would alert them to each new threat, a weakening section of path that could undermine access to the springs, a storage shed where medical supplies were kept, the chicken coop housing their small flock of laying hens. Each time, his warning came just in time to prevent disaster. By dawn, the storm's fury had begun to abate, though steady rain continued to fall. The exhausted group gathered in the cabin's main room, soaked and mud-splattered but bound by the shared experience of the crisis. "That dog saved this entire place," Kevin said. "He knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were." "He's always been able to sense what we can't," Arthur replied. "That's why we're still here." The storm continued for 3 days, gradually diminishing from catastrophic to merely challenging. Roads became impassable as bridges washed out and landslides blocked key routes. The satellite phone Dr. Brennan carried established that the entire region was effectively isolated, with emergency services focusing on the more populated areas below. During this enforced togetherness, subtle shifts began occurring within the family dynamic. The children, stripped of their professional facades and luxurious surroundings, found themselves participating in the daily routines that kept Raven's Hollow functioning, hauling water, securing structures, preserving food, and always following Ranger's guidance when new threats emerged. A critical moment arrived on the 4th day when Julia's medication supply ran out. Though her health had improved dramatically, certain medications remained part of her regimen. With roads impassable and no delivery possible for at least a week, concerns spread through the family. "Mom needs her heart medication," Diana insisted. "There must be some way to get supplies up here." Bradford, for once without ready solutions, paced the cabin floor. "Can we hike out? Find a working road?" "Not safely," Dr. Brennan assessed. "The trails will be washed out in dozens of places. We'd risk becoming additional rescue victims." It was Kevin who noticed Ranger's unusual behavior. The dog had retrieved Julia's empty medication bottle and placed it carefully beside the bag containing spring water they'd collected before the paths became too dangerous. "I think he's suggesting an alternative," Kevin said slowly. Dr. Brennan knelt beside Ranger, examining his communication attempt. "The springs have shown remarkable effects on cardiovascular health. Multiple visitors have reduced or eliminated heart medications after regular treatments. You can't seriously suggest replacing prescribed medication with spa water," Bradford objected. "It's not spa water," Arthur corrected. "And we're not suggesting anything. Ranger is." The dog, hearing his name, picked up the medication bottle again and placed it directly in front of Julia, then nudged the spring water toward her with his nose. Julia, who had observed the spring's effects more extensively than anyone, made her decision. "I'm going to trust Ranger. He hasn't been wrong yet about what we need." Despite protests from Bradford and Diana, she began a regimen of drinking water from the respiratory spring 3 times daily and applying compresses soaked in the joint spring water to her chest and neck. Dr. Brennan monitored her closely, checking vital signs and watching for any concerning symptoms. To the children's astonishment and Bradford's poorly concealed skepticism, Julia's condition not only remained stable but continued to improve. "Her blood pressure is better than mine," Dr. Brennan announced on the 6th day, "and her pulse is strong and regular. Whatever's in these waters, it's supporting her cardiovascular system more effectively than her previous medication." As the isolation continued, the family fell into new patterns. Arthur led daily repair efforts, directing his children in tasks that gradually restored Raven's Hollow's infrastructure. Diana, with her methodical mind, took over documenting the storm's effects and organizing recovery priorities. Kevin, surprisingly adaptable, became Arthur's primary assistant, revealing untapped skills with tools and construction. Bradford struggled most with their primitive conditions, his executive temperament ill-suited to the uncertain, moment-to-moment existence. Gracie, after initially refusing to participate in manual labor, eventually found herself helping Julia salvage what remained of the garden, learning despite herself about the healing plants that complemented the spring's effects. Throughout it all, Ranger remained the settlement's guardian and guide. He would disappear for hours, returning with news of passable routes, newly formed hazards, or once, remarkably, a lost hiker whom he led straight to the cabin for shelter. "Your dog should work for FEMA," the grateful hiker commented as he warmed himself by the stove. By the third week of isolation, when radio reports suggested roads might soon reopen, Ravens Hollow had transformed yet again. The storm damage, while extensive, had been largely repaired through the combined efforts of the now unified group. Some improvements even exceeded the original structures. Kevin and Arthur had redesigned the pathways to the springs with better drainage and more secure footings, while Diana discovered she had a talent for stonework, creating beautiful retaining walls that stabilized vulnerable slopes. More significant than the physical rebuilding was the emotional reconstruction taking place. Forced proximity and shared purpose had worn away some of the barriers between parents and children. Working alongside Arthur, Kevin rediscovered the father who had taught him to build his first treehouse. Helping Julia with her medicinal plants, Diana reconnected with childhood memories of garden lessons from her mother. Only Bradford maintained a certain distance, his entrepreneurial mind still calculating potential rather than embracing present reality. Gracie, surprisingly, showed the most dramatic transformation, developing a genuine fascination with the spring's properties and Julia's knowledge of complementary herbal treatments. "My skincare routine costs thousands annually," she admitted to Julia one afternoon as they applied spring water compresses to storm-damaged plants. "But nothing has made my skin look this good." "That's what we've been trying to tell you," Julia replied. "These springs aren't a business opportunity. They're a responsibility and a gift." The moment of reckoning came when rescue workers finally reached Ravens Hollow nearly 4 weeks after the storm began. A team of paramedics and National Guard personnel arrived, expecting to find desperate survivors in need of medical attention and evacuation. Instead, they discovered a thriving community, not merely surviving but flourishing despite the isolation. The cabin was warm and well supplied with preserved food. The critical infrastructure functioned effectively, with Arthur's improvised water purification system drawing admiration from the rescue team's engineer. The garden, though storm-damaged, still produced fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet. Most astonishing to the newcomers was the health of those they'd come to rescue, particularly Julia, whose medical records had flagged her as high priority due to her previous conditions. "Ma'am, your oxygen levels are better than most people half your age," one paramedic named Jenny commented. "And this dog, he's in incredible shape for his age. What's your secret? Clean living, mountain air, and the best early warning system money can't buy." Ranger seemed to understand the praise, his tail wagging slightly, but his attention remained focused on Julia, ready to respond to any sign of distress. As the rescue workers prepared to depart, leaving emergency supplies but no longer insisting on evacuation, their team leader pulled Arthur aside. "I've been doing mountain rescue for 20 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like this place. Not just surviving, but thriving. And that dog of yours, the way he guided us along the only safe path up here, extraordinary." Arthur nodded. "Ravens Hollow takes care of its own. And Ranger, he's something special." "What happens now?" Kevin asked. "We can't pretend the last month didn't change things." Bradford, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the rescue team's visit, finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what this place represents. Not as a business, but as—" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't come naturally to his profit-oriented mind, "as a sanctuary." "That's exactly what it is," Julia confirmed. "The foundation structure protects it legally," Diana acknowledged. "It's actually quite brilliant, ensuring no individual can exploit or sell the resources." Arthur nodded. "We didn't create this place to get rich. We created it because we were given a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared responsibly." Ranger, who had been lying quietly during the discussion, suddenly rose and approached Bradford, studying him intently. After a tense moment that felt like judgment, the dog did something unexpected. He placed his paw on Bradford's knee, not in greeting but in what appeared to be a deliberate gesture of connection. "What's he doing?" Bradford asked. "I think," Dr. Brennan observed, "he's acknowledging your change of heart. Ranger doesn't just sense physical needs. He reads intentions." "When we sent you here," he admitted quietly, "part of me thought we might never see you again, that the winter would." He couldn't finish the sentence. "You thought we would die," Arthur completed for him. "We told ourselves it was the responsible choice, that you'd be better off in a facility with medical care. But we knew what this place was when we gave you the keys, a ruin where 2 elderly people and an old dog wouldn't likely survive the winter." "Yet here we are," Julia said. "Not just surviving, but creating something meaningful, something that helped not just us, but others." "So, I'll ask again," Kevin said. "What happens now? Do we go back to our separate lives and pretend this never happened, or has something fundamentally changed?" The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the mountain air scrubbed clean by weeks of rain. Arthur rose early, as had become his habit, stepping onto the porch to find Ranger already alert, surveying their domain with vigilant eyes. Together, they watched the sunrise paint the peaks in hues of amber and gold, a moment of peace before decisions that would shape all their futures. "What do you think, boy?" Arthur murmured. "Can people truly change, or do they just become better at hiding who they really are?" Ranger looked up at him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond animal understanding, then deliberately turned his gaze toward the main cabin where the family still slept. One by one, the others emerged into the morning light. First Kevin, who had taken to rising early during their isolation to help with morning chores. Then Julia and Dr. Brennan, deep in conversation about new growth they'd observed in storm-damaged plants treated with spring water. Diana appeared with a notebook in hand, already documenting recovery priorities for the day. Bradford and Gracie emerged last, still adjusting to the rhythm of life without electronic wake-up calls and coffee delivered to their door. Breakfast became an impromptu council meeting, with homemade bread and preserved fruits from Julia's pantry serving as the only agenda items. For several minutes, they ate in companionable silence, the shared meal a continuation of the bonds forged during their isolation. Finally, Bradford set down his cup and addressed the gathering with the directness that had made him successful in business. "I think we need to discuss the future of Raven's Hollow, not as a commercial opportunity, but as a family legacy." Arthur studied his eldest son, looking for signs of the calculating entrepreneur, but found instead a thoughtfulness that had been absent in their earlier confrontation. "We're listening. During these weeks, we've seen something remarkable here. Not just the Springs or Ranger's abilities, though those are extraordinary. We've seen purpose, meaning, the kind of authentic life that," he faltered, then continued with unusual vulnerability, "that many of us have lost touch with in our pursuit of success." Kevin leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Bradford? That we all move to the mountain and become hermits?" "No," Bradford replied. "I'm suggesting that Raven's Hollow represents something worth protecting, something larger than individual gain. The foundation structure you created," he nodded to Arthur, "ensures that. But perhaps there's a middle path between exploitation and isolation, a controlled expansion," Diana elaborated. "A formal structure that maintains the sanctuary nature of this place while making it accessible to those who genuinely need it." Arthur exchanged glances with Julia. "What exactly are you envisioning?" Bradford gestured expansively. "Raven's Hollow as a healing sanctuary, not a commercial spa or resort, but a place where people with chronic conditions can come for extended stays, where the waters and Ranger's guidance are available to those who need them most, not just those who can pay premium prices." "And who would run this sanctuary?" Arthur asked. "You would," Bradford answered. "You and Mom with Ranger. You created this place. You understand its spirit. We could provide support, legal framework, operational assistance, funding for improvements, but the heart and soul would remain yours." Ranger, who had been listening attentively to the conversation, suddenly stood and approached Bradford. The dog circled him once, nose working, then sat directly in front of him, eyes locked on the man's face as if searching for something beyond words. After a long moment, Ranger gave a soft woof and returned to Arthur's side, the assessment complete but its conclusion unclear. "I think," Dr. Brennan interpreted carefully, "Ranger is reserving judgment. He senses your sincerity at this moment, but perhaps he's waiting to see if actions match intentions. Bradford nodded slowly. Fair enough. I haven't given him, or you, much reason to trust me lately. Gracie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. There's something else we should discuss. She glanced at Bradford. I've been documenting everything since we arrived. The springs, the improvements, Ranger's abilities. Initially, I thought it would make great marketing material. But now, Gracie continued, I see it differently. This isn't a story to exploit, it's a legacy to protect. What if we created a proper documentation project? Not for publicity, but for preservation, recording the healing properties, Ranger's techniques, the knowledge you've accumulated. Arthur studied his daughter-in-law with new eyes. The calculating social climber seemed to have retreated, replaced by someone with genuine interest in Raven's Hollow's unique properties. Documentation has value, he acknowledged, especially since Ranger's knowledge seems to go beyond what even we understand. Dr. Brennan nodded, enthusiastic agreement. From a scientific perspective, proper documentation could be invaluable, not to commercialize the springs, but to understand them. There's healing potential here that modern medicine hasn't begun to explore. The conversation continued through the morning, evolving from tentative suggestions to concrete planning. Diana's legal expertise shaped a vision for Raven's Hollow that would balance accessibility with protection. Kevin, surprising everyone with his practical insights, proposed simple infrastructure improvements that would accommodate more visitors without disturbing the site's natural character. Even Bradford, once focused solely on profit potential, found himself drawn to the concept of sustainable stewardship rather than exploitation. His business acumen redirected toward resource management and long-term preservation rather than immediate returns. Throughout the discussion, Ranger remained attentive, occasionally moving to different family members as if monitoring not just their words but their intentions. By midday, a new vision had begun to coalesce. Raven's Hollow as a healing sanctuary with limited, carefully managed access. Visitors would come by recommendation rather than advertisement, stay in simple cabins built with minimal environmental impact, and experience the springs under guidance that honored their special properties. Most importantly, the sanctuary would operate as a non-profit, with any proceeds beyond maintenance costs directed toward research and preservation. It could work, Arthur acknowledged, if the focus truly remains on healing rather than profit. And if Ranger approves the visitors, Julia added, his judgment of character has proven far more reliable than ours. The family's emerging consensus faced its first test that afternoon when a truck appeared on the newly cleared access road. Harold Jensen climbed out, moving with remarkable agility for a man who had once been crippled by hip pain, followed by his wife Margaret. Behind them came 3 more vehicles carrying locals who had become regular visitors to the springs before the storm. Heard the road was passable again, Harold called in greeting, brought some supplies we thought you might need, and a few folks who've been missing their treatments. Ranger immediately trotted down to greet the arrivals, circling each person in his customary assessment before guiding an elderly woman with trembling hands toward the path to the joint spring. Arthur introduced his children to the visitors, watching their reactions as they witnessed Ranger's therapeutic process firsthand. The dog moved with professional purpose, evaluating each arrival before directing them to the appropriate spring, sometimes retrieving specific items to enhance their treatment, a certain cushion for proper positioning, a dipper for drinking from a particular source, or herbal additives from Julia's garden. I've never seen anything like it, Diana murmured, observing Ranger guide a man with respiratory difficulties to the breathing spring. It's like he's practicing medicine without a license. Better than most doctors I've seen, Harold commented. That dog knew what I needed before I said a word. Been pain-free for months now, after years of specialists telling me surgery was my only option. As the afternoon progressed, more visitors arrived, word of the road's reopening having spread quickly through the local community. Each newcomer was greeted by Ranger, assessed, and directed to the appropriate spring. Each carried stories of healing that defied conventional medical explanation. Bradford, watching this procession with growing amazement, turned to Arthur. "You've created something extraordinary here. Not just the springs, but this community. These people trust you." "And Ranger," Arthur nodded. "The mountain chose us, not the other way around. We're just stewards." 17 visitors, Dr. Brennan noted, each directed to a specific spring, each reporting improvement. The statistical significance is overwhelming. As darkness fell, the family gathered once more around the table, the day's events having deepened their understanding of Ravens Hollow's importance to the wider community. "I think we've been asking the wrong question," Kevin said thoughtfully. "We've been focusing on what happens to Ravens Hollow, but maybe the real question is, what happens to us? How do we fit into what Mom and Dad have created here?" Bradford nodded. "You're right. This place doesn't need our permission to exist. It was healing people long before we arrived, and it will continue long after we're gone." He looked directly at his parents. "The question is whether we're worthy of being part of it." "I think," Arthur said, "that's a question Ranger might help us answer." As if on cue, the dog rose from his resting place and approached the table. He moved deliberately from person to person, spending time with each family member in turn, his assessment more thorough than his usual greeting ritual. When he reached Bradford, the dog paused longest, their eyes locked in wordless communication. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ranger pressed his head against Bradford's chest, not in affection, but as if listening to something inside the man. After a long moment, he stepped back, gave a single bark, and returned to Arthur's side. "What was that about?" Bradford asked. Dr. Brennan, who had been documenting Ranger's behavior, spoke carefully. "I believe he was checking your heart, not metaphorically, but literally." "My heart? Why would he?" Bradford stopped abruptly. "Bradford?" Diana asked. "What is it?" Bradford replied, "I've been having tests, irregular heartbeat, chest pain, nothing conclusive yet, but serious enough to make you contemplate mortality," Dr. Brennan completed. "Ranger senses these things. It's partly why he's so effective at directing people to the right springs." Julia reached across the table to take her son's hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Would you have believed me?" Bradford asked. "We would have believed you," Arthur said, "because Ranger would have confirmed it." Bradford looked at the dog. "So when he took me to that particular spring the first day, he was treating your heart condition," Dr. Brennan confirmed. "The same way he's been guiding your mother's treatment. His diagnostic abilities are extraordinary." The revelation transformed the atmosphere around the table from negotiation to something more vulnerable and authentic. Bradford's admission of health concerns explained some of his driven behavior, his urgency to secure assets, and his focus on legacy. Ranger, having completed his rounds of the family, returned to Bradford and nudged his hand insistently. "I think," Arthur interpreted, "he's suggesting you need another treatment. Tonight." Gracie, seeing her husband's vulnerability exposed, dropped her usual poised facade. "Please go with the dog, Bradford. Whatever he's sensing, trust him." In the soft glow of lantern light, Bradford followed Ranger up the path to the largest spring, the one Julia used for her respiratory issues, but which Emmett's journals noted also helped heart troubles. The rest of the family trailed behind at a respectful distance, united in concern. At the spring, Ranger directed Bradford with gentle nudges to a specific position where the water's flow created a natural shoulder-height cascade. With Dr. Brennan providing medical guidance, Bradford immersed himself in the warm mineral waters, the tension visibly leaving his body as the spring worked its subtle magic. "I feel," he began after several minutes, "I feel my heartbeat steadying, becoming stronger, more regular." Dr. Brennan monitored his pulse. "Your rhythm is normalizing. Whatever minerals are present in this specific spring, they're having a direct effect on your cardiovascular system." Bradford looked up at his parents. "I came here thinking I could help you. Instead, you're saving me." "Again," Arthur shook his head. "Not us. The mountain, Ranger. Sometimes we have to surrender control to find healing." The night air filled with a strange hush, as if the mountain itself acknowledged this moment of reconciliation. Ranger sat alertly at the spring's edge, his intelligent eyes moving from Bradford to Arthur to Julia, the guardian of a legacy that spanned generations. In the days that followed, a new understanding emerged within the Whitlock family. Bradford, humbled by his health scare and Ranger's intuitive response, abandoned any pretense of taking control. Instead, he offered his business expertise to help establish the Ravens Hollow Foundation as a legitimate healing sanctuary with proper legal protections. Diana, impressed by the spring's effects on her own chronic pain, volunteered to create comprehensive legal frameworks that would shield the property from exploitation while ensuring its accessibility to those in need. Her professional connections provided access to conservation experts who could help preserve the fragile ecosystem surrounding the springs. Kevin, who had always been the most adaptable of the siblings, discovered an unexpected talent for designing and building the simple structures needed to accommodate visitors. Working alongside Arthur, he reclaimed the construction skills his father had taught him as a boy, finding satisfaction in tangible creation that his previous career had never provided. Gracie, perhaps the most surprisingly transformed, became fascinated by the documentation project. Her social media expertise, once focused on projecting artificial perfection, redirected toward capturing authentic healing stories. With Dr. Brennan's guidance, she began creating a comprehensive record of Ranger's therapeutic techniques and the spring's effects. Throughout this transformation, Ranger remained the heart of Ravens Hollow. His ability to assess visitors, direct them to appropriate treatments, and monitor their progress became the foundation of the sanctuary's approach. Dr. Brennan's ongoing documentation established scientific credibility for what might otherwise have been dismissed as folk medicine or placebo effect. "What you've created here," she told Arthur and Julia one evening, "is a model of integrative healing. The springs provide the minerals, Ranger provides the guidance, and the community provides the support. It's what medicine should aspire to but rarely achieves." 6 months after the storm that had forced their reunion, the expanded Ravens Hollow welcomed its first formal group of visitors. Elderly individuals with chronic conditions that conventional medicine had failed to resolve. The selection process, overseen by Dr. Brennan and a committee of healthcare professionals, prioritized need over ability to pay, with a sliding scale that ensured accessibility regardless of financial resources. Ranger, now the official therapy director with human handlers as legal proxies, greeted each arrival with his characteristic assessment routine. Age had not diminished his abilities. If anything, his extended exposure to the springs had enhanced them. At 11 years old, he moved with the vigor of a dog half his age, his once graying muzzle now showing more black than white. "He's like a living example of what the springs can do," Kevin commented. Medical Benjamin Button. The sanctuary's reputation spread carefully through professional networks rather than commercial advertising. Doctors with patients who hadn't responded to conventional treatments began making discreet referrals. Research institutions proposed careful studies of the water's mineral properties and Ranger's therapeutic techniques. Local residents continued their regular visits, maintaining the community connection that had sustained Ravens Hollow through its early development. Bradford, who divided his time between the mountain and his business responsibilities in the city, underwent a transformation as profound as the physical changes in his parents. His heart condition, treated regularly with Ranger's guidance, stabilized to the point that his cardiologist described it as a medical anomaly. During one of his visits, he brought his children, teenagers who had previously been too busy with private schools and scheduled activities to visit their grandparents. Initially skeptical and attached to their smartphones, they gradually succumbed to Ravens Hollow's magic, especially Ranger's uncanny ability to sense their unspoken emotional needs. "Grandma," Bradford's daughter asked Julia one evening, "how does Ranger always know exactly what's wrong? Even when we don't say anything?" Julia smiled. "He listens with more than his ears. He listens with his heart. It's a skill most humans have forgotten." The girl considered this. "I think I'd rather learn what Ranger knows than get more followers on Instagram." This simple moment of connection across generations illustrated what Ravens Hollow had become. Not merely a place of physical healing, but a sanctuary where deeper wounds could mend. The children who had once abandoned their parents now found themselves drawn back, not by obligation but by genuine desire to participate in something meaningful. Kevin eventually moved to a small cabin on the property, his architectural skills enhancing the sanctuary while he gradually withdrew from his former career. Diana maintained her law practice, but redirected it toward environmental protection and elder rights, with Raven's Hollow as her touchstone for authentic purpose. Even Gracie, once defined by material acquisition and social climbing, found new identity in documenting the sanctuary's healing stories. The most profound transformation, however, remained with Arthur and Julia. The couple who had arrived broken and discarded now stood at the center of a thriving community, their wisdom and experience valued rather than dismissed. Arthur's practical skills and Julia's nurturing nature found perfect expression in the sanctuary they'd created from abandonment. We thought our story was ending, Arthur reflected one evening as they sat on the porch. Instead, it was just beginning a new chapter. Julia nodded. The children threw us away like we were useless. The mountain showed us we still had purpose. Ranger, lying contentedly between them, raised his head at their voices. At 11 years old, he showed no signs of slowing down, his eyes still bright with intelligence and purpose. The springs had given him extended vitality, just as they had rejuvenated his humans. "And you, old friend," Arthur addressed the dog, "you knew it all along, didn't you? That this place was waiting for us, that we were meant to be its guardians." Ranger's tail swept the porch boards in what seemed like agreement. Then he suddenly stood, ears perked toward the access road, his posture alert but not alarmed. Minutes later, a vehicle appeared, Kevin returning from town with supplies. But he wasn't alone. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Dr. Brennan, and in the back, an unexpected visitor, a young German Shepherd mixed puppy, its markings strikingly similar to Ranger's. As the truck parked, Ranger trotted down to meet them, his attention immediately fixed on the puppy. The younger dog emerged cautiously, then approached Ranger with a mix of deference and recognition that seemed beyond normal canine behavior. "Found her at the shelter in town," Kevin explained. "Something about her reminded me of Ranger, so I asked Dr. Brennan to check her out." The veterinarian watched the two dogs interact with professional interest. "Her DNA results are fascinating. She shares genetic markers with Ranger that suggest they're related, possibly a descendant of one of his puppies from years ago, though the generational distance is hard to determine." Arthur remembered Emmett's journal entry. "Rex's pups have scattered across the country, but I believe one will return someday when the springs are needed again. The dogs remember what humans forget, do you think?" Julia began, watching the puppy follow Ranger's movements with unusual attentiveness. "That she's here to learn from him?" Dr. Brennan completed. "From a scientific perspective, I shouldn't suggest such things, but after everything I've witnessed here," she shrugged, "Ranger won't live forever, despite the spring's remarkable effects. Perhaps this is nature's way of ensuring continuity." The puppy, as if understanding she was the topic of conversation, approached the porch steps. She studied Arthur and Julia with an intensity that seemed beyond her tender age, then deliberately placed one paw on the bottom step, not climbing, but making connections. Ranger returned to his position between Arthur and Julia, looking from them to the puppy with clear expectation. "I think," Arthur said slowly, "we're being introduced to the future of Raven's Hollow." Julia nodded. "Welcome, little one." The young dog climbed the steps with surprising dignity for her age and settled beside Ranger, their postures mirroring each other as they gazed out over the sanctuary they were born to protect. As twilight deepened into evening, Arthur reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun in betrayal and abandonment had transformed into purpose and community. The children who had discarded them as burdens now participated in their legacy. The mountain that should have been their exile had become their kingdom, and through it all, the constant had been Ranger, their companion, guardian, and guide. The dog who had shown more loyalty than their human family, more wisdom than medical professionals, and more healing ability than modern pharmaceuticals.